Okay, we are live. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and maybe even good morning if you're joining us from across the ocean. This is Coast to Coast EVs, your fortnightly fast charge on electric vehicles and infrastructure. It is truly fortnightly now. We're back on our even keel after skipping last week to get back on our schedule. But I did create this page. Thank you to Paul from Bakersfield for the reminder that it's quite hard to follow us sometimes. So we are now on this calendar page. It's just kind of will be updated as often as I can muster new guests and folks who will be coming on. So I will add topics and include this down in the description so you can check out the page and see what's coming up in future fortnights. And a quick reminder, we are also, after the live stream, available next day audio, usually by about lunchtime Eastern, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and anywhere else you can lay your podcast home. So with that, thanks for joining us. Let us know where you are and what you're driving. And introduction to my fellow Coast to Coasters, Mr. Eric Way of News Coolum channel over on the West Coast. And back on the East Coast with me, Mr. Walter Scholze down in the Southeast of the Network Architect channel. Eric just pushed a video live, which is too tempting to click on. I was about to do it and then realized we had 2 minutes, so I couldn't do that. So thanks for that temptation. Yes. And Walter has more videos than you can shake an EV stick at. So definitely go out and check the channels after we finish this. How are you both doing?
Doing okay. It's back to the hundreds in California again. So.
Oh yeah, you've got that heat wave coming back.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see. We'll jump into the news here, which we have a few topics since we missed some pieces. So we're just going to go around. I'm going to start off with loves because I think we've talked about this in the past, and this is one that I was pretty excited about. I know, Walter, you covered it on the channel when it was breaking last week, but essentially Love's Travel Stops, who are the third most award-winning chain or entity for National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure awards, and who also have their own kind of patchwork network of different providers at the moment at certain Love stations, have firmed up their details on where they'll be putting in chargers. We've already got a couple under construction in New York State, and Pennsylvania and Kentucky are supposed to break ground before the end of this year. And then there's a whole slew of states coming online in 2025, apparently. So I wanted to quickly run through a video I had, if I can find it, because it was actually a location that I really wanted to. I've actually gone to the extent of filming it when I've gone past. This is in Waterloo, New York. Every time I drive past this site, I've wanted there to be a station because there is one down the road at the Electrify America, but it's about 4 or 5 miles off the interstate. And this is where there will be one of these new EV charging stations with canopies. Looks like they're using the ChargePoint Express Plus. And if you look at the map, it's about 4 times what they've got right now. They say they have 100 chargers in 11 states. So that's, a decent size for it to start off with. But this is going to be a much more progressive, really accelerating their plan, kickstarted by the NEVI Awards, but also, really going to town on some of these with the kind of Pilot Flying J, Canopy Field, dog parks, 24/7 access. Walter, you did the video on it, and you've got a canopy right behind you there. What are your thoughts on the kind of initial details dribbling out of Loves there?
Yeah, so this is NEVI doing its thing and bringing new players into the sphere that wouldn't have otherwise been there, because when there's government money being handed out, everyone's got their eyes and ears perked up. So Loves is, in my opinion, going to have the biggest bang for helping provide competition where there was none. The whole interstate corridor system is rather sparsely filled in. Most of the time, I've noticed when I have to go charge on an interstate trip, I need to get off the interstate, go down 3 stoplights, turn into the local shopping mall or something. All those properties that are immediately off the interstate aren't typically lit with really nice brand new DC fast chargers, minus Pilot Flying J and what they're doing. And so all these additional players, Loves included, that are coming into the fray as a result of the NEVI programming is going to provide the competition I think that we desperately need, and try to get a commodity pricing going instead of a somewhat exploitative pricing that we had been seeing. So,
and they, you're right on the NEVI side. We actually just got Arizona's locations in the last 24 hours or so, and I think Loves was tied with Tesla at either 6 or 8 locations. I can't remember, of the 18. So a fair chunk of those, and that wasn't even mentioned in their the press release last week. So you've obviously got a little bit extra added to it. The reason I say it's 4x is because the 100 chargers that they have at the moment, if you look at the map and times it out by the 4 ports that they'll need for most of those, will be about, it's going to expand on the initial the 100 they've got there. It looks like it will take it to about 400 ports.
and those red dots are really not theirs. They only actually have a couple of stations that are native Loves chargers. Really, what those are other people building on their site that,
Right.
they're taking claim for. Okay, they're allowing hosts to put chargers on their property, and there is some economic back and forth there. So I suppose you can claim that those are chargers on their site and everything, but those are not really Love's chargers. But these new ones will be.
Eric, how are you seeing the Loves news?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm happy to see it. I love to see it, right? Yeah, the thing is, in California, quite a few of the Loves locations have had chargers already, and kind of to Walter's point, they're usually like EV Connect. There's some of the BTC Power 150 kilowatt chargers that they list as 350 kilowatts, so everybody gets their hopes up until they get there, and they were very expensive too. That's why a lot of people, I avoided them, never really used them, because they were, at one point in time, they were 80-90 cents per kilowatt hour. And that was like 4 years ago when everybody else was still charging 30. But the other thing that makes me wonder too is, for a while, Loves had a deal with Electrify America. And I have to wonder how much walking that back had to do with all of the flack that Electrify America started to catch in terms of reliability and brand reputation. And then maybe just seeing Pilot partnering with GM Energy and EVgo gave them the idea of maybe we should just kind of go our own way with it, and just kind of not, because there was one site in particular in Northern California that was ripe for an Electrify America charger. I was waiting to see it go in, and it just never did. Right, so just that intersection of Highway 20 and Interstate 5 in Northern California and Williams, California. So I'm looking forward to it. It's just like Walter says, it's just having these travel locations just off the freeway, the amenities you need while traveling. They're looking to do canopies as well. So it's going to add a decent amount of competition for the nationwide travel corridors. So I'm definitely looking forward to it. I don't mind stopping at Loves. I'm, not a brand loyalist.
And more people are talking about dog parks. It seems to be one of the kind of things after canopies and squeegees that people love to see. So that's definitely a feature of these as well. They made sure to call it out on the press release. Yeah, well, it's just good news. I mean, obviously we have to, just like with Iona, these are press releases and we want to see them turned into physical installations. But I think anything that can move the needle towards a lot more interstate charging is a good thing. Okay, so next, I'll actually leave it to Eric. What do you think about the next story? What's caught your eye, if anything?
Well, I think I'd mentioned it in our chat, but this is just a side note. But the GM Samsung joint venture in New Carlisle, I guess is how you pronounce it. But they're delaying it by a year, and it's very terse, very, very short blurb on it. But basically, they're saying it's market conditions, and I have mixed feelings about that, because one thing I would like to see from Ultium is to have them diversify their battery partners and their battery portfolio. I think the Ultium cells they're building right now are ideal for large SUVs and trucks, not necessarily for smaller vehicles. So getting Samsung in, I think, gives them a little bit more diversity in their portfolio. But they're only delaying it by a year. And I guess just to kind of connect back to the last story, maybe with all this NEVI funding, what we're really seeing is that chicken and egg dilemma finally solved, that as all of these automakers start to maybe slow their rollout of new EVs based on market conditions in the retail sector of consumer sector of buying new vehicles, if while they're pausing or delaying all of these new charging networks get built out, you're going to see 2 years from now people decide to look at EVs again, and suddenly, instead of having 2 networks to choose from nationwide corridors, they now have 6. Right. So now all of a sudden it's like getting into an EV is a much easier sell. So who knows? Maybe we're just seeing them delay long enough for the infrastructure to be built, for the market to correct. But I'm not too worried about it. It's just that was the one of all of the joint venture for Ultium Cells LLC. That was the one that I was looking forward to the most, just to give GM a little bit more diversity in their battery portfolio.
You think they have what they need in the manufacturing pipeline here with the other ventures to make good on the kind of promise of Ultium as it comes to market?
I think so. And I mean, Walter, you might be able to speak to the numbers a little bit better than me, but just the LG alone, the amount of gigawatt hours per year production battery capacity is easily enough to push their domestic vehicle production into the 1 to 2 million per year range. So that's just with the LG partnership. So Samsung would have been, I think, over and above that. So I definitely think they have enough to meet the current EV market demand. But you should be building your battery facilities years ahead of demand. That's what we've been seeing, time and time again. So.
Yeah, without foresight, you get stuck with lack of production capacity. And I think really that was the Indiana site's mission, was to not build batteries for 2024 and 2025, but to build batteries for 2028 and 2029 when we're looking at a different landscape. So.
Okay. And Walter, anything you want to touch on before we exit Newsland?
Yeah, so it's been a while since we've convened, and the Rebecca Tanucci is, I believe, how it's pronounced, resurfacing at Uber kind of caught my attention, and I can't decide if I was her, if I would try to be bringing Tesla deals into the Uber fray or not, or if I was still stinging a little bit from having a abrupt dismissal of me and my team. I don't mind if you fire me, but you fire my team also. It kind of leaves a lingering ouch. So I'm kind of curious about what that entails, because Uber is not a CPO, and that's really her mission in life, is to build a infrastructure for a CPO, unless Uber has plans that we're unaware of. Or they're trying to, I know there's been discussion about electrification incentives for Uber drivers in other countries with BYD vehicles. If there's something similar in the works for the North American market, or if this is just a global position and she's looking to provide expertise in the electric vehicle space in general to Uber as an organization. So what that really entails has not really been clarified, just that she's coming on board, or whether or not Uber is going to be building rideshare charging stations. That was kind of my hope and my first reaction when I heard it. But then I started to think, well, maybe she's there in order to bridge Tesla purchasing power from her previous position into Uber's community. So, lower cost Teslas for Uber drivers, something along those lines. So I'm not quite sure exactly what that role entails, but it definitely has got a lot of positive benefits for people who are part of the drive share community. So it's definitely good news for the electric vehicle
I think
enthusiast and drive share.
it speaks to the level that she's at as well, right? Is that, you know, Uber is clearly that, you know, top tier name as far as both the software and the rideshare services in general. That's, you know, a household name, and that's the kind of role that you would have expected her to land in. But you've also got the others that went to companies like Revel in New York City and Los Angeles. So there's folks from that team that are starting to spread out into players who that rideshare play is going to be quite important, because we've seen, you know, with Revel building out charging hubs, with the mandates in certain cities like New York to go for the taxis and the rideshares to go electric by a certain date. That's going to start to push the need to have that EV transition. And, you know, someone who's got that amount of time and that level of experience under her belt, there's not too many of her around, I would think. So probably pretty big feather in the cap to have that on board at Uber.
Well, I was going to say, if Uber isn't a CPO, they probably should be. Rideshare is one of those areas that's taxing urban charging infrastructure more than anything else. I think Out of Spec recently did a video on that, talking about how difficult it is to even access a charger in LA at this point. And, you know, they didn't mention it in the video, but as someone who's been living and working in the LA area, you know, and driving an EV for years and years and years, I can tell you with certainty that rideshare is a major contributing factor to the overcrowding of the charging infrastructure in LA. It's just, they need their own charging hubs, and they need them badly, and they need to be kind of segregated from the rest of the public charging.
And one of the ways you could segregate them is just put them on like gravel lots that are, you know, kind of in a industrial park or something, you know, away from where retail people would want to have them. But the rideshare people don't mind going another 3-4 miles off the beaten path in order to have discounted charging. I mean, they would love that.
Yeah, they just need to take away the incentives for charging for free on a lot of these public networks.
Even better, quiet for them, because that's where they can take their naps.
Yeah.
Charged to 100%.
Charged to 100%.
Alrighty, moving through to the comments. Let's say hello to everyone, then we can say hello to our guest for the evening. Paul in Bakersfield, California, made it this time. I hope the calendar helped that along somewhat, and thank you for the nudge to do that. That was on my list for a long time, but welcome. Thanks for joining us. And then a 2020 Bolt with a new battery. That's all the good things that you could want. Mike Mahan, who is working right now and heading up Costco shortly. Thanks for tuning in just for a sec, even if you have to do the retail afterwards. Appreciate it. And he's in Southern California. Bill B, Tampa, Florida, Q8 e-tron and a Porsche Taycan. We've commented before, but lovely electric garage. Congrats. Brian Ribby over in humid Minnesota. And you should certainly catch up with some of his recent trips. He's been on the road as well, so go and check out Brian Ribby Drives Electric. John Baker from the UK. How long you can stay awake? Indeed, thank you for joining at all, but we appreciate you, and I know it's past midnight there now, so night owl indeed. Scott Goslin, good evening from Central Illinois, 2017 Chevy Bolt. That's 3 bolts now. Let's see how more we can collect. Welcome. Anthony, greetings from the beautiful Pacific Northwest. Can vouch, is beautiful. Want to go back. Mark, hello from Worthington, Ohio. And Walter, Mr. Flying J. Yeah, and pilot. In a Nissan Leaf, indeed. Welcome, Leonard. Good evening again from Tulsa in Tesla Model 3. I'm going to crank through these here as quickly as I can. Thank you, everybody, for joining us and letting us know where you are. Steve from Massachusetts sounds eerily familiar in a Hyundai, but it's a Kona EV, so thankfully we can divert there from my Ioniq 5. More level 2 chargers at grocery stores would be great. Absolutely. 25 miles of charging should take care of weekend errands. No charging at home. Yeah, that could help. If you can get away with 25 miles, all the better. I'm not sure I could manage that with the kids' activities and schedules, but if you can do it, more power to you. Welcome. Silence Do Good Howdy from Muggy Muskegon, Michigan. Been there as well. Very nice. Nice trip across America. Watched your first leg. Good. Thank you very much. The next one is going to be a little bit more scenic than Indiana, I promise. Ariel Batista, hello from Jacksonville, Florida, in an Volkswagen ID4. Northeast Florida. Chris, I'm going to butcher the name, but apologies. Spychalski from Massachusetts as well. Thank you. Crazy Postman, welcome from Southwest Oklahoma. Still driving a 2002 Ford Explorer that sometimes runs. He is waiting on a Tesla. I'm sure everybody knows this saga by now, and we're all...
he got some news that is coming soon.
Oh, so. Good. I didn't catch that. You're always ahead of me on these, so thank you for...
At least that was my understanding at last time I did a check-in.
It's worth checking out the channel and subscribing just to stay on track with the saga and how desperately he wants to get away from combustion again. Stephen Redditch from Seminole, Florida, looking to get a Kia EV6 once they upgrade to NACS J3400. Absolutely, that should be any time in the next 6 months. Crazy Postman, we've said hello to, but says Francis charges at Love's and Walters should not even count. Do you have Francis chargers of yours, Walter?
No, I think that might be a brand. I'm unfamiliar with what he's referring to there.
Okay, not your house. Okay, we won't stop by. Let's see. Binaural Auto, I hear Loves is going well with CP250s. What do you think? Yeah, they're going to be ChargePoint Express Plus units by the sound of the press release and the images. That looks like they're going to do 160 kilowatts, which I'd guess is 2 dispensers at each site, pushing about 320 kilowatts max. I'm not sure how they'll configure, but definitely ChargePoint from what we've seen in the pictures. And just seeing if anyone else I missed. Yes, I absolutely did. And I should shout him out because Chase is the next guest up in a couple of weeks' time. So good evening and thank you for reporting in. Andy Getch, who I believe is down in Florida. But correct me if I'm wrong. Thanks for joining us. And Jed, welcome, clarifies that Tanucci's statement said that she's moving towards promoting electrification in general, not just charging. So that should be interesting.
Yeah. That's helpful.
I think we've got a couple more. Thank you for that. Tom Palmer in San Diego, another bolt in the house. I think we should start an owners club right here. Eric is our leader. And just as a reminder where Chase is, Chase Drum over in Hood River, Oregon, host of the Grid Connections podcast. As you can see, you should definitely go and check that out. There was a recent episode, I think, on today on Chinese electric vehicles. Not exactly sure what the topic was exactly, but I have that in my to listen list. So I am ready to go and listen to that shortly after this and Eric's video. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, for bearing with us and introducing us, letting us know where you are. So now I'm happy to bring up our guest, who is Mr. Chuck Hayward of Revision Energy. Good evening, Chuck. Can you hear us okay?
I can, yeah. Forgot to unmute myself there before I joined.
No worries, just making sure we have you audible. And Chuck is from a New England-based company called Revision Energy, who I've had the pleasure of seeing news from regularly in my various feeds. He himself drives a Hyundai Ioniq 5, much like myself, around New England. But I won't steal your thunder, Chuck. Thanks for joining us, and let us know what you're up to, where you come from, and what you're working on right now.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here. I will point out that I turned on the blanket fort background since you said you do this podcast every fortnight, so I figured I should join with the theme. So
appreciate it. Thank you.
I got a little chuckle there. That's the level of my humor, as you'll see. So
sorry,
yeah.
Right.
Highbrow.
Yeah. So I work at, as Steve said, I work at Revision Energy. We are mainly a solar company based in New England with branches across Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. We got about 500 employees now, and we just celebrated our 20th anniversary last year. Threw a pretty great party for everybody, including a live band that was powered entirely off of Ford Lightnings, which was a pretty cool setup for us. So, and we do PV, heat pumps, batteries, and then I'm part of the commercial EV charging team. And as we like to tell everybody at Revision, EV is in our name. So we have done a lot of work doing commercial charging at retail locations, businesses, for workplace charging. We do multifamily charging, and we've done a lot of the public charging infrastructure in Maine and Massachusetts. a little bit in New Hampshire, even a couple in Vermont over the years. I think for a while, Steve was using a picture of our chargers that we put in at Kennebunk, which were the first public Express Plus chargers in the nation. So we've got a lot of experience with doing that too. Personally, my background, actually early in my career, I was a teacher. I was a middle school math teacher, and given the quality of my jokes that I tried there, that shouldn't surprise anybody. And then I spent about 10 years working as a researcher on college mathematics education, and kind of reached a point in my life where I was looking for a change, and decided to go back to school and studied electrical engineering at the local community college when I moved to Maine. Happened to get connected with Phil Coop, one of the co-founders of Revision, who came there. And, as they say, the rest is history. Very, very happy to be here, doing the work I'm doing. And surprisingly, finding that a lot of the background, part of what I like about this industry is that with it being as new as it is, most people who are in it have done other things earlier in their career. And I find that makes for some interesting stories. And, personally, I find being a teacher has really helped me learn how to communicate about EVs. Because when you're teaching, you're learning how to identify misunderstandings and not say what you want to say, but say what people need to hear. And I think that's been really helpful to apply to the work I do now. So.
Presumably, your travels take you all over the Northeast here, and I definitely have seen some of your kind of exchanges with folks who are maybe less than enthusiastic, shall we say, about electric vehicles. Any of those recent kind of interactions, or how have you used that kind of background in teaching to maybe bring the education component to electrification and electric vehicles?
Yeah, I've had some interactions with people at chargers. Quite a bit. It happens with people who rent EVs. Often they're not expecting to get an EV, but then they're at the airport, usually in Boston or somewhere around there, and that's the last car available, and they end up in an EV, and you run into them at a local charger, and they're trying to figure out how the apps work and what to do. So it has been pretty interesting. I had an experience. I think it was about 2 weeks ago. I ran into a guy. I was going up to Jackman, Maine, which is almost at the Canadian border, for a kayaking trip. Spent some time up there. Ran into this guy at Skowhegan at some chargers, and he was in an EV6 that he had rented, and pretty unhappy about it. Wasn't expecting an EV. Wanted to do a road trip. Had a lot to say about that, and a lot of words that I probably shouldn't repeat in here. And then at the end of the weekend, after it was over, I actually ran into him again at the charger in Jackman. And his tune had totally changed after having the experience, and just talking about how fun it was to drive, and how, as he said, it's got a whole lot of get up in the EV6. Completely changed his tune on it. But that was funny because, with him, I didn't really try and change his mind at all. I just told him, I was sorry that Hertz stuck him with that, and they really should do more to educate him about it. I hope his trip went better after that. And then, just had the fortunate experience to run into him again and see that it had, he had changed his mind quite a bit from just being with an EV and actually experiencing it, instead of going off of the things he had been told and heard about them before.
I feel like there's a potential role at pretty much every rental company to have a teacher there to create some kind of education program about how these things should be used, not just for the people that rent them, but for the people that take the reservations and hand them out at 10% state of charge, or wish you good luck. You drive off into the charging deserts on. Eric, Walter, everybody else can leave questions down in the live chat, but either of you have anything burning to quiz Chuck about before we get into our main topic?
Well, I could just. So you said you installed the DC chargers. I probably can't even pronounce the name that you mentioned. The Express Plus chargers that Revision installed those. So. Yeah, because I've run into a few different crews that install chargers and things, but what we're seeing, of course, now is public chargers seem to have like regular upkeep requirements, right? And it's maybe something I think was overlooked for a while, but between just abuse and damage, which I actually just experienced in my recent trip, to just failing components over time, wear items. Do you actually see that as a business opportunity, like moving forward, as having like this maybe an active technician support role for like regional support, hardware support and upkeep support for these DC fast chargers or level 2 chargers as well?
Yeah, that's something that for a lot of charging companies. So we do design and installation for charging sites, and we're starting to own and operate some of our own too. We've got a few level 2 sites and even a few DC fast charger sites that we own and operate. The ChargePoint Express Plus ones I mentioned actually owned by ChargePoint directly, but we did the install for them. But the challenge with a lot of these is that, it's usually the network that has the program to keep these up to date. And, you can be a service technician, you get dispatched, but a lot of those, they want nationwide providers. So they're not having local contracts with all kinds of people. So, they'll dispatch some service provider that may have to fly out there and then drive to the charger. And it's not quite as efficient. So we've been trying to figure out ways that we can do that more locally, because it is going to be a big issue, especially as a lot of these grant programs and federal funding have uptime requirements that, you need to have them fixed much more quickly. Not even just from the driver perspective, you want them fixed, but from a legal perspective as the owner,
Right.
they have to be.
Okay. Yeah, that's kind of, and that actually maybe explains some things too, because to me, if I were a network operator, I would much rather interface with local and regional support than, like you said, have a nationwide technicians that you have to fly out.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, so we're trying to do some where we can do our own kind of service and keep, parts, like oftentimes, especially with level 2, connectors will be left on the ground and run over and they crack and it's a simple switch. But, going through the process of calling the network, getting them to dispatch someone is much less efficient than being able to fix it regionally with just having those parts locally. So it's definitely a business opportunity, especially as the network keeps growing and there's more and more chargers around.
Walter.
Yeah. So, Chuck, two things. And first off, I want to say I appreciate a professional such as yourself coming onto the podcast. And although you say you're kind of green and new to the industry, the truth is that you work at it 5 hours or 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. And there's something to be said for the familiarity with the technology that it being a part of your routine brings. So definitely appreciate you bringing that here to the podcast. But a couple of questions. You mentioned about the level 2 implementations that you guys have been doing. Two things. One, has captive fleets customers been as big of a build that we've been hearing about? We hear about the United States Postal Service, and I know you guys don't have that specific contract. And obviously Amazon deliveries, which are third party from Amazon Corp, have been putting in a lot of level 2 chargers. And it seems like a lot of fleet operators have been gravitating towards electric. We're hearing that the e-Transit at Ford and other delivery vehicles are in very high demand. And the Ford F-150 Lightning I see with fleets around this area quite a bit as well. And all those need to charge somewhere at some fenced off area in a depot at night, or maybe they take them home. I'm not sure. But has the captive fleet customer base grown for your area as much as we've been hearing about?
It's starting to grow. We operate a fleet of electric vehicles. We're not fully electric yet, but we have a number of electric sales vehicles, Konas, Bolts, things like that. And we have a number of F-150 Lightnings too. So we've got 12 chargers at our headquarters in South Portland that we use for that. And we've tried to use that as a model that people can look at when they're thinking about going electric, and show them that we actually, it's possible that we do it with our cars. And looking at, I know this, I've listened to a few episodes of this, and it tends to be a lot of talk about DC fast charging. And that's what people are interested in. But I find the level 2 much more interesting personally, and much more challenging, especially from a design perspective. And the question with fleets a lot of times is, looking at when are they going to be parked and what kind of charging speed do you actually need, and avoiding those demand charges. With level 2, you want to charge as slow as possible so that it has the charge you need when you leave. Anything else above that is kind of wasted in a sense. And that's a really fun problem to figure out from a design perspective. So we're starting to see that with fleets. We've had some small scale installations with police forces that have, a couple of EVs, municipal building, government buildings that have a couple of EVs for their fleet, but not full scale in the sense yet that like Amazon is going to have, or the post office or anything like that. I think a lot more of the kind of fleet type installation we've had has been multifamily apartments and condo buildings and things like that, which is pretty similar to the needs of how
Very
a fleet would
similar, yeah.
operate, but not technically a captive fleet, like you said.
Mm-hmm. And secondly, GM, Ford, and Tesla all seem to be testing the waters for combination of vehicle to home and vehicle to grid types of technologies. You mentioned your company does solar, and there's also a lot of products that are coming available that are making solar battery storage kind of plug and play, very intuitive, doesn't take a lot of expertise. Are you seeing customers coming asking for off-grid, EV charging, solar to battery to EV for residential homes more frequently? Because it seems like that is definitely a market that could absolutely start to become gangbusters here if the cost of solar keeps decreasing and the cost of those batteries decreases as well. You've got a pretty compelling play for homeowners who have EVs to charge them for free. Obviously there's some costs in the capital and everything, but is that something that is starting to gain traction in your perspective?
I have that conversation all the time with EV owners that I run into. I work on the commercial side, so we don't see it quite as much. The residential side, they get that question a lot. And our residential sales, I'll hear questions from them all the time from people that want to be able to do this. It seems silly to pay to put in like a Tesla Powerwall if you've got 70, 80 kilowatt hours of battery sitting in your driveway, or 100, or depending on the car you have. Personally, I would love something like that. As Steve said, I have an Ioniq 5, and Maine gets a lot of power outages. We have a lot of storms, a lot of trees. The utilities are responsible for the entire state, which is largely rural. So I've had multiple instances since I bought my Ioniq 5 where we've lost power for a day and a half or more, and I've used that just to power the fridge, make coffee in the morning. It happened right around Christmas time. We turned the Christmas tree on and we watched a movie, all powered off the car with just an extension cord coming through the window. So that's been getting me through so far. But that question of like an actual integration with the car, with solar, with your battery, with, just being able to power some loads off of your home in an emergency situation, power up at camp if you don't have a grid connection there. All the time we get questions about that. And it's definitely, the interest is there, and the technology and the legal ability to do it, I think is coming soon.
Yeah, I definitely think that's going to start taking off here pretty soon. And I think we've got questions from the audience as well.
Yeah. If I can jump in line, because you did remind me, Chuck, as being in Maine, and this is, I guess, one of the FUD issues that we always hear about with solar is just in terms of its effectiveness and how well it's selling and how well people are embracing it. Because in terms of the lower 48, right, Maine has to be in the top 5 for the lowest, solar radiation levels and sun exposure, right? So how is that going, and how effective are you seeing the solar installations and customers in terms of, not just accepting it, but like embracing it and appreciating, the power?
Yeah, I wasn't expecting to get solar questions, but I'll do the best to channel my co-owners that do solar on that side. As they often like to remind everybody, we're at the same latitude as the French Riviera, right, which is famously sunny, and we actually have a lot of, it's a great solar resource that we have here. The latitude works well, and the colder temperatures actually make solar more efficient too. So it has been. There's been strong support for it through state policy in Maine, especially, and it just makes sense, especially given how high the utility rates are here. Residential utility rate is 21 cents a kilowatt hour where I live, which, around the country, that's pretty high. Not quite as bad as you see in like some spots in California. Right.
Right.
But, it much higher than you see in a lot of other places. So solar just economically makes a lot of sense here. And it does perform well, maybe not as well as you might see in like Arizona or somewhere like that, but it's enough to make economic sense up here.
All right. Thank you.
And
Got it on record.
On the other end of the spectrum, Maine's a pretty solid installation rate for heat pumps, right? For the winter side, which again, if you're making, I know Boston doesn't get winters to write home about anymore, but I'm sure mid to northern Maine is very different.
Yep. Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
I've been all heat pumps for 4 years now, and it's never had a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think I've run into anybody other than cleaning them. Some people have been talking about potential mold buildup and needing deep cleans on, but other than that, in terms of handling the winter, they seem to absolutely knock it out of the park.
Yeah.
Jumping to the comments for any questions for Chuck. So I'm going to have to pass this one a little bit, but Chris asks about V2L and how to measure the watt level. I'm not sure about the installation piece about that, but in terms of the power output, at least from the Ioniq 5, we're looking at 1.8, 1.9 kilowatts, as far as I'm aware. I think you can speak to this, Chuck, having powered a concert by it before. Now, 150 Lightning is much closer to 10 kilowatts, right? What are you seeing in terms of that range for vehicles powering, pushing power out instead of taking it in, and the levels that you're looking to?
Yeah, I think Ford and I believe the Cybertruck are both around 10 kilowatts, in that range. I forget the exact numbers. I think one's 9.2 or something like that, or 9.6, but up in that range. But like you said, the Hyundai and Kias are around 1.8, I believe. I have an electric grill. I've grilled chicken powered off of my car just to see if I could, right? So it's some serious power that it will output. And I think it's enough to get you through most emergency scenarios. The only problem with a V2L setup like Hyundai and Kia have is it's only 120 volts. So the only thing I can't power is my oil pump. But everything else, that I need to power off of it is pretty helpful. And it does not like electric motors to power those sometimes, because they get that high inrush current and they have very little tolerance for that. So I tried to power an air pump one time, a big air compressor, and even though it will run off of a standard home circuit, that's the same output. It just, that immediate inrush current like tripped it every time. Yeah, that's the only thing that I've ever tried to power that I could power off of a home circuit that wouldn't work off of the car.
I think I failed with my lawnmower initially. I couldn't power that off.
Yeah, same thing.
Everything else pretty well, probably for the same reason.
Yeah, the Lyric recently.
Strange.
Lyric recently released an accessory for $350 that will vehicle to load up to 3 kilowatts. And I was looking at what that would do, and it could do an air conditioner, because the air conditioner apparently is about 800 watts, and a refrigerator and coffee machine. As long as I have those 3 things, I think I'm fine. But that's interesting about the Rush. I don't know if I'd pop the circuit by turning on the AC for the first. A little window mounted thing. It's not a heat pump. It's a little window mounted thing, just in order to get through the heat.
It's worth trying. All these things are videos, potential.
Yeah,
videos.
let us
know. Bill B says, my next EV must have vehicle-to-home capability. I definitely think people are starting to realize that power can go both ways in electric vehicles. And as Chuck said, it's a large pack just sitting out in your driveway waiting to be used potentially. It's a really big area of potential for sure. Skimming through now, because we do want to get to our main topic at some point this evening. But also I think Jed's question here will bring us onto it nicely. Are there NEVI, which is National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Plan, or IRA incentives for workplace charging and apartment L2 charging? Chuck, do you want to have a quick stab at that one? And we can move on.
Sure. Yeah. So there's part of the bipartisan infrastructure law is the the CFI portion of that, which is the community fueling infrastructure, I believe. So the NEVI program is all the 50 miles along the corridors, and that's all fast charging. But the CFI is up to the states to apply to and determine how they want to use that. So in some instances, it's individual towns or cities that are applying to it. I'm in Maine, and Maine put in a coordinated state level strategy. We won one of the awards for the CFI round 1, and currently have 4 different RFPs open for workplace charging, multifamily homes, community centers, things like that. And that's how the state has decided to implement that money. There are still some requirements through the same legal requirements that govern NEVI about charging speeds and interoperability and everything like that. Also has sections about level 2 that apply to any of the money that comes through the CFI. So it's a little different how every state is implementing that, but that the point of that portion of the money is definitely to go towards lots of level 2 and DC that's not necessarily along those designated alternative fuel corridors.
Yeah, and one of the stories we didn't hit, but was this week as well, was another $521 million yesterday, I think, going to 29 states. But under that CFI program that Chuck's mentioning there, and looking at the breakdowns here, it was around 200 million was going to alternative fuel corridors, but obviously the breakout of that 321 million is then community projects. So that's where we get into the multifamily dwelling, potential workplace charging, that side of things. So there's a lot of announcements. It's hard to keep track. NEVI's quite easy to keep track of because it's a small number of sites that have gone in at the moment, and the states are dragging their heels a little bit. But there's a lot of money at the same time going into those CFI grants, and a lot of projects should be coming out of those in the next couple of years. Let's see, make sure I missed anything else. I don't think so. And we'll go back to the comments as we progress here, but I want to get on to our main topic, which would be, is your state eyeing EV dollars? So that kind of touches on what we just discussed a little bit, but taking it a little more broadly. And maybe we're probably in danger again of going into exactly what Chuck's saying with focusing on DC fast charging, even with the site behind me as one of Chuck's coming up. I think may not have been totally clear, but it's the White Mountain Visitor Center up in New Hampshire, which is going to be a key location heading into those White Mountains for having that DC fast charging, which did win a conditional NEVI award for fast charging. So that's one of those, but obviously there's a lot of other dollars floating around, and part of this, the kind of the wider context to it is, at some point EVs need to get to every state. EVs need to be able to travel through, but also to and stay around states that have ample EV charging, whether it's DC fast charging to get them onto their destination, or level 2 charging that we're talking about at all of the kind of places we talk about it being, whether it's a city center, tourist destinations, downtown areas, municipal buildings, all of these kind of community projects that support wider EV travel. So kind of as we've talked about, traveling the nation, and obviously DC fast charging plays a role in that, we're trying to move on to how our regions are doing in terms of attracting those EV dollars, serving EV drivers who try to travel through them, who try to stop in various places, and maybe spend money in those communities if they actually have the time and inclination to do so. Is there infrastructure there to help them do that? So I kind of wanted to go around everyone on this, just to kind of have a feel for what your region's like, how you feel different areas of charging have progressed over, maybe the last year. But, is your state or is your region maximizing the potential of, attracting these EV dollars? And Walter, I think we can go your side first.
Glad to. Yeah, there's quite a bit of capitalization on the EV incentives that are coming out of the federal government. There is a large project in North Carolina that was awarded in Kings Mountain that I think is 70 level 2 chargers at an intersection between Interstate 85 and US 74, which is a pretty good junction, and Kings Mountain sits right there, and they're going to do it at 3 different municipal lots. So all level 2. And I've got my eye on that because I'm hoping to actually talk to the people and do a whole story on it, because I think it's a pretty interesting event. But prior to that, there's been similar to other areas of the country where disbursement of federal funds has been made available to states for electric vehicle infrastructure build-outs, both DC fast charger and level 2. I'm seeing the level 2 is mostly pushed through the power companies, likely by their own incentives, or through government subsidizing the power companies in order to encourage them to do so. It's kind of a mixed bag throughout the states in this area. But one state that's completely decided to check out is South Carolina. I used to work in a town called Fort Mill, South Carolina, which meant I had to cross the border from Charlotte into South Carolina every day. And there's a big sign that says alternative fuels corridor. And there was a picture of a EV charging thing. Nothing, man. There's no South Carolina funded chargers anywhere, in not only there but in the state. It's like they just said thanks but no thanks, and that just boggles my mind, because if you walk into a dealership now to purchase an electric vehicle, there's $7,500 on the hood, if assuming it's a qualifying vehicle. Who would say no? Why would you say no? I don't want that money because it's coming from the federal government and might have some strings attached. No, it's free money, and really everyone else has been allowing the money. And as far as I could tell, there's no strings attached here. You just need to meet the qualifications, and the grants are released to your state and then dispersed off, and it's win-win-win for everyone. The federal government gets the bragging rights, and the states get the administration and the greater good of their population and everything. So I don't understand why South Carolina and West Virginia is also notorious for that as well. That's not really my area, but I do know that West Virginia is a similar circumstance. Just boggles my mind that state administrators would choose to just walk away from the free funds that are available. No one else in my area has done so. Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, and Florida, they're taking the money happily.
And South Carolina has significant beach destinations, right? As far as I recall, I'm never sure where the delineation is.
Myrtle Beach, yeah, it's a major destination. Charleston, and so tons of things to do in South Carolina that are touristy centric, and other pretty heavily industrialized over in the western portion of the state, but no state-funded DC fast chargers or level 2 chargers.
Continuing round, Derek, how's things looking? Northern California.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think
further out.
Yeah, I think North Carolina is doing better than Northern California. So and I'm gonna start focusing on Northern California a little bit more specifically, because I think not only does everybody have the stigma of California being everybody has a surfboard and goes to Hollywood, but yeah, Northern California is lagging way behind. And, to Chuck's point, I think there has been an overemphasis on the DC fast charging. And it seems to be what everybody's talking about. And to me, I'm seeing it almost more just of an imbalance, right? So there's some movement with the DC fast chargers, but there's zero movement with the level 2 charging is what I'm seeing. So very little in the way of level 2 charging communities. I'm going to feature a road trip pretty soon where there's literally a 300-mile gap in California in the public charging, infrastructure for fast charging. There are level 2 chargers along that route, a grand total of 2. So, I think there's a lot, and with Northern California, it is a section of the state that's been overlooked. So you have all of this money coming into California, whether it was through the California Energy Commission grant funds, or through, it's not really NEVI, but through the CARB with Electrify America, and they still left large swaths of the state completely uncovered, completely without any sort of, whether it's DC fast charging or level 2 funded charging. And so, yeah, my take on California is much more pessimistic. You go south of here and it's a little bit better, but even there, right? Like, so if you go down to like Ventura, California, it's mostly a lot of the like the EV advocacy groups that are pushing through the community level 2 charging. It's not really coming from like you're actually having to have locals solicit and lobby for the installation of this equipment. It's not coming through at a state level that I can see at all, right? It's just, if you're not raising your hand and screaming, to use another teacher analogy, Chuck, nobody's going to call on you. So that's what I'm seeing here is there's a lot of communities that are being left behind, and maybe like that EV6 driver that you encountered, where they don't have any firsthand experience on EVs, and until they do, they're not going to change their mind. Well, now you have these communities who are just sitting silently, being completely ignored by state and federal funding because nobody is going to go and champion for them. So that's what I'm seeing at least in farther in Northern California. So.
And as far as the Northeast, Chuck, I'm sure you can speak to this significantly more than I can. Happy to interject wherever there's gaps. But you live and work in a state that is kind of, as Eric describes, right? Many people maybe think of Maine as Portland and the fishing towns and the kind of coastal areas of southern Maine. But there's a whole big rural expanse, as you kind of touched upon, up there on the way to the border with Canada. And a lot of those communities, I think, actually, from what I've seen, have started to move towards getting that rural charging, whether it's DC fast or level 2 installations. But what do you see in, Maine first, but more broadly, New England as a whole?
Yeah, so thinking about the question about attracting tourists with EVs, I think about it kind of in phases, right? When EVs are early, you can put in charging and attract people because you have it, and it's like a new thing, right? Like 10 years ago in Oregon, they had these kind of trips you could do with EVs along the coast there, right? And it was like, you have an EV, come here, it's an EV vacation. And I think that is where a lot of it started, was to make it possible. And in Maine, we had some of those things in the early. We have the Efficiency Maine Trust, which does a lot of the, has managed a lot of the Volkswagen money, the NEVI funding, a lot of stuff like that. They do heat pumps, they do a bunch of things, but they've managed a lot of the funding programs for EV chargers, and have been really good about making a strategy for that to, in the beginning, attract people and say, you can come here in your EV and like make that a trip. But I think it's shifting now to where we're getting to the point where it's like, you're not so much attracting people to places as you are deterring them if they don't have EV charging. And I think that's the way that it shifted quite a bit. So the strategy did put EV chargers all over the state to make it possible to travel basically through the state on an EV. As I mentioned, Jackman, pretty far up there, Skowhegan, like pretty far up there. There's not a lot of EVs around there, especially at the time that they were installed a few years ago. But it made EV travel possible. I was just talking to Steve. You went all the way out to the very eastern tip of the U.S., right, in far eastern Maine. You can do that now in an EV because these are there, and I think it's shifting to the point where there's both the travel through places, but then there's also thinking about when you're at a destination being able to enjoy it. So I've done a number of trips throughout Maine where I can get there and maybe back with a single charge, but can't really do anything when I get there unless there's charging, right? So that's the phase that Maine's at now, in putting in what we're calling a lot of destination chargers. So places like Greenville, Maine, up by Moosehead Lake, you can put a lot of miles on if you're up in that region, just exploring all around the lake, right? So you can get there, but then if you want to be able to explore, you have to do this calculus right now of like, do I want to sit at the couple level 2s that are there for a few hours, or do I, but there will be DC fast chargers there in the future. So I think that's the stage we're at, and it's been this really nicely planned and tiered kind of rollout of where charging is happening and where, what it's making possible. We also work in New Hampshire, Massachusetts. New Hampshire is kind of on the other side of things in terms of where they've had their strategy. Been pretty slow to implement that, not as much of a centralized kind of state plan. Maine has had, I think, 5 rounds of Volkswagen funding that funded chargers. New Hampshire's still doing their first. So very, very different approach, but, New Hampshire, like Ski New Hampshire, this advocacy organization, they're taking the approach of, if we don't put in EV charging, we're going to lose tourist business to ski mountains in Maine. They're going to go there if they can charge instead. So it's shifting to that conversation of like, not are we attracting EV drivers, but they're out there and we need to retain them here instead of them choosing to go somewhere else where it's easier.
I think I'm glad you made those contrasts, because it is, on our doorstep here, and it is the most clear warning to states that are dragging their heels. I mean, it may be too late, but there are some of these, places like West Virginia, as Walter hinted at, Wyoming, which has Yellowstone. A lot of these locations do have attractive destinations. And New Hampshire, although people have still gone up there and it's a relatively small state, the White Mountains, as you say, are kind of difficult to get to if you're not in a Tesla. It's really, this location behind me will make a big difference, but that's the kind of place that Maine would have put in about 4 years ago, probably. And these are the routes that are starting to get, in Maine they already have these, and there's still some work to do because it's such a big, expansive state. But New Hampshire is, because they haven't taken advantage of those early Dieselgate funds at state level, because they haven't necessarily attracted the Electrify Americas of the world, other than that god-awful station in Lebanon, New Hampshire. They really are now behind, and you can get there, and I've done the trips to the White Mountains, but if I'm looking at, the 3 states north of me, I probably go as Maine because of the things you've put in, Chuck, and the team there has done, and, going over to Bar Harbor, Acadia, easternmost area, as we've talked about, Vermont, because, again, although they haven't really accelerated as Maine has, they've still got a lot of legacy 50 to 100 kilowatt kind of units in all of the ski places and pretty much all the way up to the border with Canada. And then New Hampshire, a little bit distant behind because it's just harder. There are destination charges. Individual resorts and hotels have helped to bridge that gap by giving you somewhere to charge when you get there, but that's not really a strategy. It's just luck rather than judgment. So I think that, that's probably playing out across the country. When I go to places like Utah, on this trip that we'll get to eventually, that, they've got Rocky Mountain Power there. They're putting in DC fast charging in Moab. They're putting in around the state in the ski resorts, different locations that are very valuable. And then you've got the likes of Pilot Flying J going in. You've got Electrify America putting in stations. So they have all of the things that are already happening on a nationwide level, but it's bolstered by that state level intelligent look at, how you need a strategy, where you need these things, where there are gaps, and kind of as we've, touched on with Evolve New York in the past with John Markowitz, how they've done it and brought charging to the places that are a little less likely to be catered to. But then on the other side, you have your Wyomings, which definitely have that, Electrify America presence, and there are some of the legacy providers, but at the same time, they're running the risk of lagging behind. I mean, people are still going to go to Yellowstone, but they'll probably charge in other states, stay in other states, and then just hop in and out as you start to get to this, more mainstream level of adoption, and states that have just dragged their heels over the years when it really mattered. Let's see. I'm going to jump to the comments quickly in case I've missed anything. I've missed quite a lot. Apologies. Stephen St. Peter up in Bucksport, Maine. Chuck has spoken to you with David at Chargely. Some solid Maine EV denizens right there. Let's see. What else have I missed? Photogravity up in just another vote for heat pumps up in New Brunswick. So if it works up there, if it works in Maine, it goes down to -30, and you can happily heat pump your life away with through the winter. What else have we got? Paul over in California just touches back to the charging and fueling infrastructure grants that got announced yesterday. There's tribal centers in Independence, California on the 395. Sounds like that might be an important one, Eric.
Yeah, it's adding some redundancy. But yeah, that's that southern portion of Highway 395 as well. So
let's see. Leonard over in Oklahoma, talking about the EV dollars with Pilot Flying J, Tesla loves. Yeah, so although I'll have a Nevi update out soon. At the moment, it's I think it's Francis took the top spot from Tesla as the most Nevi awards. Then Tesla were just behind them, and Loves was actually coming up third now. They won another 6, as we mentioned, in Arizona. A lot of these still not out there yet. Pilot Flying J is by far the most actually under construction and installed right now, but looks like Loves will start get cracking with that soon as well.
And is that for number of sites or number of dollars, or both?
Awards, site awards.
Okay.
Dollars is kind of skewed because Tesla does it so much cheaper.
Right.
For whatever reason, again, we can argue the ins and outs of how Tesla does Nevi with the site again up in Chuck's area of the country with Rockland, Maine. But yeah, they've won fewer dollars, but the most sites along with Francis there. Justin Hayward. Oh, sorry, Jason Hayward, who I'm assuming is related, Chuck.
Yes, yes, that's my brother.
There you go. Thank you for supporting the family links. Let's see. Tom says Walter lives in a small state area. He should speak for the entire Southeast. Yeah, I don't see why not. I mean, you'd have to go do an entire episode on Florida, but you can certainly talk to the Carolinas and Georgia right now, right?
Yeah, I used to be a resident of Florida for a decade. I haven't called it home in a while, but it's definitely got a piece of my heart. But yeah, Southeast has definitely been vibrant as of late for a number of different reasons for the EV players coming to the States.
Let's see. Okay, and maybe we can kind of dive off to the side a little bit here, especially as we have Chuck on. Mentioning the 97% uptime requirement for the stations that fall into disrepair from Nevi. Crazy Postman asks, is there a way to report non-working stations to the government? I know what I've read, but Chuck, maybe you've seen a little bit more technical details on the side of Nevi requirements and how they will be policed.
Yeah, there's actually a system that the government is setting up where you have to report your data. I think it's quarterly. You have to put it in there. I believe it's called EV chart, but there's all kinds of metrics that are defined that you have to put in about your chargers and uptime and things like that, and report a bunch of stats to the government. And it's, each state is kind of handling it differently, how they're going to enforce that uptime requirement. Some of them have, are only making payments for the awards, partial payments each year based on the uptime, meeting the uptime requirements. Some of them have performance bonds. So it's really, every state is handling it differently, how they're going to enforce those uptime requirements and what the kind of legal mechanism will be for doing that. But there is a federal requirement to report data.
And we're coming up, I mean, we've certainly had 6 months of the Ohio Nevi sites and some in New York being active. That must be starting to filter through pretty soon if there's been stations in the ground for that long, albeit only a handful of them. Presumably that reporting is going to start filtering through to at least internal agencies fairly soon.
Yeah, and I'm assuming the Joint Office will put out white papers about it at some point. They do a lot of publications about the Nevi programs at some point in the future, though, right?
And Chuck, if I can ask, do I understand correctly that your primary focus in your day-to-day is with multi-tenant dwelling installations of level 2? Does that sound right?
Not necessarily the primary focus. We do that. We also do a lot of fast charging. It's, the work of installing EV chargers is driven so much by the incentives that are available. So it really depends on what's out there. When there's a DC incentive out there, all of a sudden everybody wants to install DC, because it's covered 80% or whatnot. And then the same is true when there's an incentive available for multifamily.
Incentives and also regulatory changes. And I was wondering if you had seen anything concerning regulatory changes for multi-tenant dwellings where states or municipalities are requiring some form of charging to be present on new builds, or right to charge laws, anything like that. I don't know if you've seen any movement like that either in your area or anywhere else in the country. I have not, but I was just kind of curious your thoughts.
Yeah, we have a few municipalities around us that have that built into their building stretch codes about preparing for EV charging at multifamily and even at any parking lot, essentially. We worked with the city of South Portland to develop their ordinance to determine what the right level, both in terms of how much charging was needed, but also what the speed of each one of those ports needs to be. And that's now adopted in their building code, in the stretch code. So anytime anytime there's a new construction or a parking lot is replaced, there's certain requirements depending on what kind of business or amount of housing it provides that will determine how many sites have to be prepped and have conduit in the ground, how many have to have a charger installed, how many level 2 versus how many DC. So it's starting to filter through. We've seen that there, and then there's some other local municipalities that are working on putting those codes in there too.
Interesting. Thank you.
And a quick question from Leonard, probably works for Chuck as well. What incentives are there for multi-tenant dwellings? I'd love to be armed with that info to give to landlords.
I think that question really depends on where you're asking about and what's available. I know the incentives in Maine pretty well for that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there are incentives everywhere else. Like I said, the CFI money that's available is being implemented differently in every state, in different municipalities. So the incentives are really driven by the local context.
It does take us back then to the state-by-state approach, right? I mean, and this is, uniquely US because there is so much, in fragmentation and different, government across the country. But maybe it's worth talking a little bit about where that lies. Is there going to be a problem point somewhere down the line here where the states that have really moved forward, as we've spoken about, the strategies that they have in place are serving EVs and are well placed, and will we just avoid the ones that haven't done it? I mean, you can see with a West Virginia, no disrespect, that it's not that hard to avoid. There is, charging all around. You can literally just, as someone said, go around. But, there are states here that are going to have more problems, right? There's going to be some of these areas where if you can't get across them, as Eric's talking about, I mean, California is going to be okay, I'm sure, but you maybe look to some of the states that are in those tourist areas or have national parks, or Florida, which is potentially going to overlook its less well-off communities because it's all the money goes initially to the big names and the interstate corridors and the rich affluent areas. Long story short, are we in danger of having that haves and have-nots on a national level here in the States? Anybody?
Yeah. So if it was determined by government funds, I think there's that problem and other problems that might be introduced. There's trying to be equity introduced to the disbursement of funds for alternative fuel corridors. But I don't think the United States government is going to ultimately solve the electric vehicle charge. I mean, what they're doing is noble, but I think just sheer demand for charging, necessity is the mother of invention sort of concept. When people need to get to work and they have an electric car and the electric car costs less than the internal combustion car, people in the community are going to know, hey, I can get these people to stop at my store and get a cup of coffee and a donut on the way into work and stop by and get a energy drink and a hot dog on the way home if I put in some EV charging. And I really think that's going to be the major problem solver for what you're describing as far as equity of EV charging. I think it'll hit ubiquity as need arises.
But Chuck, we know how long it takes to put in DC fast charging. We know even level 2s can take a while here. I mean, surely there's something to be said here for that strategy, building it before it's needed, because, I mean, it's great to say the private side will solve it, or when there's need, it will eventually be put in, but that could be a gap of 12, 24 months, maybe longer. It's a kind of incumbent, surely, upon some of the public entities to start catalyzing this and doing exactly what NEVI is doing by saying, there's money available, we've got a vision here, let's make it happen before the need overwhelms the sites.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of this gets into the finances of operating a charger, and that could be, a whole episode or two all on its own. But, that's the biggest thing with these is the operating costs of a charger can be quite high, and those stay relatively flat as you get more utilization. But in order to actually make money, you need lots and lots of people to use your charger. So a lot of the funding, like the whole idea behind it, is providing that incentive to get you over that hump until you have enough people using it, right? And I think that's where the real difference is going to be, is that the people who have taken advantage of these programs are getting that kind of jump start on the rest of the industry. If they, when it gets to the point where it's like, hey, I can attract customers to stop at my store and buy something, they're going to be footing 100% of the bill plus paying those same operating costs. So it becomes very different for the early adopters versus those that wait until the funding is not available. And I think that makes a big difference. But to get to your question too, Steve, about like what we just avoided, I think a lot about the interstate system and when that was made in the U.S. And thinking about how we went from state highways that you'd go through these small towns and you'd stop in these small towns and go to the restaurant or fill up gas there or whatnot. And then we built the interstate system, and all of a sudden a lot of these small towns didn't get an exit and people just drove right by them and the downtowns kind of collapsed. And I think the same thing could happen with EV charging on areas that don't allow drivers, to stop there, don't have the infrastructure for drivers. They'll just go right by them. And it's not just that they're losing like the EV charging business, they're losing all of the business that is driven to their restaurants, their stores, everything that's in that community. And that's one of the biggest challenges, is that there's still this perception that when you put in EV charging, you're giving up a parking space. But really what you're doing is making that parking space a driver of business for the local businesses. And I think that shift is happening slowly. And the faster that happens, the faster that communities come to that realization, the better off they're setting themselves up for the future when more and more people are driving electric.
Chuck, you kind of primed for a question that I was wanting to ask you anyway, is how much do you find yourself having to do, like, I'll just call them interventions for lack of a better term, with clients, where I know we talked about the difference between DC fast charging and level 2, but a client comes to you with a request that just doesn't meet the needs of their property, or, like essentially just suggesting softly to them or pushing them in the direction of charging that maybe makes more sense for their business model, for their location. So like, I'm thinking like town centers maybe don't need 350 kilowatt DC fast chargers. They'd probably benefit from the level 2 chargers. But if you have a convenience store, don't put in a 50 kilowatt charger and a 6 kilowatt level 2 charger and call it a day. So I don't know how much you get involved with like the strategy form, I guess, of the planning is what I'm asking.
Yeah, that is my favorite part of what I do, actually. And part of being a local company is like we're rooted in our community here, right? And the whole way we're successful is the relationships we have with the customers we work with. And that is hugely important, that, we don't just want to chase incentive dollars to put in whatever is going to be funded. We want them to have a good experience with that once they're owning it and operating it, and that it's actually doing what they were hoping it would do. So that's a really big part of the way that we try and work with people, is to make sure that we're designing a system that works for them. If there's an incentive available to help with that, even better. But it's really making sure that system meets their needs. And I love looking at those kind of problems. And unfortunately, there are plenty of examples where the incentive drives charging that is not appropriate, like hotels that end up with the DC fast charger. No one's going to go out and move their car in the middle of the night when they're done charging, a half an hour after they plug in, right? Really, level 2 or level 1 would be far more appropriate for that. But they put in DC fast charging because there's some make-ready program from the utility that covers 100% of it or something. So that does definitely happen in the industry. And I think it does a disservice to EVs in general, because then they're unhappy with it. They share their experience, and other people are like, why would I ever want to put one of these in? So
right.
It's a big issue. And one of my favorite things to get into is really making sure that we're meeting the needs and the use case.
So much like Apple says there's an app for that. I'm pretty sure Walter's channel, there's a video for that. And he did this one on a hotel that had fast charging only, right? A blink charger. Now, I can't remember, was that put in, Walter, with state level funds?
Dieselgate.
Dieselgate, okay. So that links me up nicely to another there here. But there was no level 2 on site there, right? This was just
none.
Okay. So Leonard asks, how much of our problems today are because the VW settlement funds didn't have any reliability strings attached? Did the chargers designed to get those funds get cheapened to maximize profits? So we talked a little bit about the value of Dieselgate funds, and I think some of that probably feeds into Efficiency Main's early plans, right? Because a bunch of those sites did benefit from that funding and have been very good. I don't think, I would even say cheaped out. I think just what was available at the time, because the CPE 250 has been the weapon of choice for most government agencies trying to install charging with Dieselgate funds. But is there a place where that's come into the conversation? Has there just been, we need to install fast charging wherever a site host will let us go because that's all we've got available? It's much easier to just slide it in than to go and do the site assessments and say this site's better than that site because maybe they didn't have that choice of sites.
As far as the site selection, I am unfamiliar because I'm relatively new to the electric vehicle community. So I'm showing up kind of at the phase where things are flashing over to the commercialization of implementation of DC fast chargers. And I'm kind of curious about what your guys' perspective was during, the early days when options were few and far between, and all of a sudden all this funding swooped in to save today. Was it effectively implemented or not? Because my perspective is different. My perspective is that convenience store operators are in the process of showing up with a large bag of cash in order to solve this problem. But there was a whole decade's worth of slugfest that went on prior to this point where we are now.
I'll say this, and maybe Chuck, you can speak to this as well, because this has been my experience, at least over the last 8 years, and not to defend Electrify America too much in particular, but they were using 6 years ago, they were installing cutting edge technology that had never been tested before. And I would say that 6 years ago, we didn't even know that reliability was really an issue. Right, because I remember the 50 kilowatt chargers, the ABB units that EVgo had installed that were bulletproof in some neighborhoods, sometimes literally. And with Tesla, they were never having any issues with their chargers that we knew about, or at least it wasn't widely published. So outside of discrete acts of vandalism at specific sites, there was really no reliability issue until Electrify America started to try different charging providers, and a lot of them turned out to not be as reliable or not be up to the task, right? And I think ChargePoint maybe dealt with that a little bit too, even with the Tritium V-Fill weren't the most reliable chargers that they started installing later. So I feel like the reliability I think it's a trap. It's a hindsight bias trap, because we know now that a lot of the equipment that was being pushed out in 6-7 years ago was maybe not where it needed to be in terms of like I don't know, like just reliability, but just in terms of quality and design and robustness, it just wasn't where it needed to be. Lessons learned, we can move on now, and now we have a reliability metric that has to be met for that public funding. So I just feel like it's a little bit of hindsight bias based on what I saw 6, 7, 8 years ago. We never had these types of reliability issues.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think, the other thing too is, like we were talking about, the incentives get you over that initial period of low utilization when it's not quite profitable. And if you look around the industry, we're just getting to that point where a lot of the chargers are becoming profitable in the last year or so, where there's enough EVs on the road. So, looking back with the benefit of hindsight, some of those chargers, like if they broke, it's like, why would I want to fix it? It's just costing me thousands of dollars to operate this thing, right? So in some sense, it made sense to not fix them for a lot of operators, I'm assuming. But I think now that we're getting to the point where they are profitable and you're losing that revenue stream when they're down, I think that reliability will, there's a business case to keep them operating and running as people are using them. And people are counting on them now as we get more and more EVs. So I think it's just kind of a natural flow of as the market kind of builds and as adoption grows. But we're getting to the point now where it makes sense to keep them reliable. Not just that it's required, but it actually makes sense from a business case. And I think that's what's really going to flip things going forward.
There's a brand reputation issue, right, as well too.
Definitely.
So.
I mean, and I would say, just as an early adopter, I was very glad a lot of those Dieselgate places went in Michigan, Maine, Vermont to an extent. There's a lot of places and trips I can point to in our Bolt EVs that wouldn't have happened if those Dieselgate funds weren't spent. So I don't know, but they were profitable, and maybe they have fallen into disrepair on occasions, but they have definitely bridged a gap, to Chuck's point. And kind of landing the plane here, getting into the last little bit of topic before we finish up. Jed asks, is there any role for level 1 charging at hotels and apartment buildings, or always worthwhile to invest in level 2? Kind of gets to my final question of where we're best spending dollars and how to promote EV charging. A lot of money can go into it, and we need to make the right decisions, of course, but we can touch on the value of level 1 quickly, and then maybe just go around and weigh in on where do you think states can do the best bang for your buck? What should they really be focusing on as we get into this mainstream piece of adoption? And I'll go in reverse order back with Chuck.
Hotels obviously make a lot of sense, and slow charging at a hotel makes sense because you just have time overnight, right? It's a hotel. So I think that there's definitely a use case for level 1 charging or even low powered level 2 charging at hotels. I think a level 2 charger setup, my philosophy is as many plugs as you can, even if they're not all full power, and a system that can somehow distribute it to whoever needs it. Because some people are going to show up with 75% charge, some people are going to show up with 3% charge, and you want to be able to distribute that. So when the car with 75 is done, you're directing more of it towards the car with 3, so it's charged by the morning. So I think there are lots of systems that can be installed that kind of operate like a level 1 or a level 2, and allow that flexibility, because predicting human behavior is the hardest part of all of this. I joke with my co-owners who do solar stuff that the sun is much more predictable than people. So EVs are hard to tell what the future is going to be like, and I think that's the biggest challenge. But one of the things that I think is I think promoting EV tourism, not just putting in chargers, but promoting EV tourism. Steve, you pointed out my brother's on here. He's converted an ATV to be an electric ATV, and was telling me that there's a part in western Upper Peninsula of Michigan where the DNR is putting in charging stations for off-road vehicles, not for cars, but for off-road vehicles, so that you can ride off-road, and on ATVs and side-by-sides and whatnot, electric. And the ability to kind of take advantage of electric tourism in situations like that, like thinking how nice that would be to have a quiet experience of enjoying the wilderness instead of hearing tailpipes ripping through the forest all the time. Or even, I'm sure you've all seen like the safari vehicles in Kenya that are converted Rivians, and thinking about the ability to kind of be in a natural space and not spook animals. So you can enjoy that. I think there's lots of opportunities for electric focused tourism that can be better because it's electric.
I do want to put this in there. That's a perfect segue into my shameless self-promotion, but this is about as wildlife as you'll get. And we were very quiet for these buffalo herds over in South Dakota. We had to wait for them to get to our campsite, but having an EV was definitely the kind of strong point. And this is where the V2L came in handy with a boondocking site in the middle of the Badlands. I was going to wait till later, but I appreciate the segue there. Thank you, Chuck.
Yeah, and I don't appreciate you camping in my yard, Steve.
Sorry about that. It did look a little bit more than California, but it did not have any EV infrastructure, so it was not as good as Weed or Reading or all those locations. Eric, so promote. I mean, you can talk about L1 if you want, but also promoting EVs.
Yeah, I still have a little bit of doubts about level 1. And the only reason is, and it's because of American cars, or American EVs, I should say, just aren't really that efficient. If we were embracing e-bikes a little bit more, or more efficient EVs, I would love to see more, level 1 at hotels. At this point, though, I really do think that 3 to 6 kilowatt is probably the minimum I think you could justify at a hotel. Where level 1, I think, still makes a world of sense, though, is at airports, airport parking, long-term parking, just level 1, 120 volt at 8 amp, and just plug in and go on your 2-week vacation to Bali or wherever you're going. But yeah, for hotels, motels, I would prefer to stick to that sort of level 2, just because right now, I think the only cars that really get supported by level 1 that I've seen are the plug-in hybrids. So my Chevy Volt, that was great. I used to charge that, like I said, out of my living room, right? It was literally plugged into the same socket as my TV in my living room. And I just dropped the EVSE out the balcony. And I would wake up every morning and I'd have 40 miles of EV range. And if that's all you need, or if that's all your battery can take, then level 1 is absolutely perfect for that. And like you said, it's that low cost solution. But outside of that, I would prefer to see primarily the level 2, even if it's low power. I think it's maybe a little bit more appropriate. Oh, that was the only other question. I had a question for you, Chuck, though, about that, though, too. That CFI funds, you said there were speeds related to that. Are we seeing more of a push towards the 40 amp, 80 amp now, or are they still embracing that 6.6 kilowatt sort of 30 amp standard?
So the standard that's built into the federal funding is 6 kilowatts, not even 6.6, but it's 6 kilowatts per port at all times. So that is a challenge, because it also has to be made in America, and a lot of manufacturers are building their higher powered units in America now to qualify for that. So, oftentimes you have to put in a larger charger, even though you're only required to do 6, or faster charger, I should say, even though it's only required to do 6.
So it's 6 is the requirement, but you're going to get 19.2.
If it's installed that way, right?
Yeah.
And Walter, you can weigh in on level 1 if you'd like, or any parting thoughts on promoting EV infrastructure in tourism?
Yeah, so as far as tourism goes, this might be absolutely surprising to the people on this panel and also in the audience. But I was at a pilot truck stop, which is basically his mission in life is to fuel long haul truckers on hauling goods around. That's their job in life. And I was talking to a supervisor. I walked in, and their address was on a list of locations that was going to get VW Dieselgate funds for DC fast charger build. There was a supervisor behind the counter. I know he had a name tag and everything. And I said, "Do you have electric vehicle chargers here?" And his response took me a little bit while to process what he said. He said, "You mean the ones that go in cigarette lighters?" And what he was saying was, electric vehicle charger. So you take a cigarette lighter adapter, and then you could charge your cell phone from the cigarette lighter. That's what he was thinking I was saying. He had no concept of what an electric vehicle was or an electric vehicle charger was. And I said, "No, I have an electric car and I would like to charge it. And I think this location is going to be getting one." He said, "Well, let's go talk to the maintenance guy. He might know." And so I followed him outside, and there was a guy bent over a tool chest, and he looked up, and the supervisor said, "Do you know anything about electric vehicle chargers?" And the guy looked up. He said, "You mean for cigarette lighters?" and they weren't joking. I mean, that was how, when you say electric vehicle charger, that was the only thing in their world that they understood I could be talking about, was something that plugged into a cigarette lighter. So I think if you install electric vehicle chargers, what you're doing is not only providing a service, you're also educating the local people. There's a lot of rural areas in this country where people are not familiar at all about electric cars, but you have electric vehicle chargers like this thing here at a pilot truck stop. All of a sudden, all those people know, and they're accommodating. They're nice people. They just are unaware of what it takes in order to drive an electric car on a road trip. So there is one good side effect to having a government-funded charger, level 2, level 1, whatever that's designated as an electric vehicle charging location, is you're providing a service to electric vehicle owners, but you're also educating the local people that this is actually a thing. People actually do this thing, and it kind of turns the lights on a little bit for them. So anyway,
I think no simpler example of that, and making that kind of commonplace EV charging on the scale of vehicles was driving around Vermont, which is a friendly EV area, and following some of their EV charging signs, which is great. I think signage is a simple thing that could be added and really does start to percolate in the minds of people who are driving combustion vehicles all the way around. But I could have followed 2 of those signs and did. One of them led me to a 6.6 kilowatt charger in a just off the interstate, which was not going to get me much further. The other one led me to the latest NEVI site up in Bradford, Vermont, which is going to max out my Ioniq 5 and give me full power. So that's there are grades of this, and I think that stuff like that is well intentioned, does very, very good things for promoting electric vehicles, but could go terribly wrong if it's just followed by the kind of folks that maybe are ahead of where the people Walter met, but follow off on their EV and just look for the charger and then wonder why it's going to be ready tomorrow evening instead of in the next 30 minutes after they've finished their snack. But I do value the signage one way or another. I think that's about all we've got time for. We could talk for days, I know, but I appreciate the insights, Chuck, into the region that I call home, and the wider EV space. And yeah, it's really valuable to hear from you. Thank you. I hope we can do it again sometime soon.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been fun.
I want to make sure we shout out Revision Energy. That's the website, revisionenergy.com. Anything we should know about where to go, what we should look for as we kind of follow up on the conversation here?
There's all kinds of good stuff on there. I mean, you can learn all about the company. If you're in the Northeast, you can look at getting solar on your home. You can join a community solar farm. So there's all kinds of stuff. You can even find Sunsquatch if you want to. Sometimes they make an appearance on the website.
And then for you,
I won't explain that more, so you'll have to go look and figure out what that means if you don't know already.
Sounds interesting. Yeah, you got me intrigued.
I have no way to post edit this, so people will have to figure that out by themselves. But if you go to Chuck's LinkedIn, I know you can see the F-150 Lightning powered concert that you mentioned. That's in your headline banner, I believe. Anywhere else you'd like people to connect with you or to direct them beyond the sites in your LinkedIn?
No, that's the only one I have. I'm not on Facebook or anything else. So LinkedIn is the place to connect with me and hear everything I have to say about EVs.
It's worth doing so because you'll learn a lot about Ioniq 5 ownership up in the more remote areas of Maine. And you can find Mr. Eric Way of News Column channel, and he just pushed a video, which I'll watch after this one. So you've got something freshly baked to go and check out.
It's freshly something.
What's it about? Let's tell us.
Oh yeah, I just did a quick check of the charging infrastructure up in Northern California, and so Electric Era gets my stamp of approval right now. They're doing some good work up there, so I'm looking forward to seeing more. So
outstanding. And you can catch Mr. Walter Schultze over at the Network Architect channel, as I mentioned. Tons of videos and plenty of them we've talked about today. Anything you want to call out, Walter, before we head out?
Yeah, I've discovered why Tesla isn't posting into the alternative fuels corridor data center. It's because they obviously had an intern who was assigned to the task who did nothing but browse their telephone all day and didn't actually do any work. And now that they've gotten rid of the person and sent them back to school, I just checked and there's like 70 Tesla sites that are going to be on next week's update. So stay tuned for that. There's a couple of 40 stall sites, and a couple several 20 stall sites. There's just a massive amount of Tesla sites that will be on next week's update.
There you go. If in doubt for a charging station, blame the intern.
It's got to be the reason.
We ran over a bit, but thank you everybody for sticking with us. We will be back in a fortnight's time on what I believe is September 11th with Chase Drum of Grid Connections and Anthony over in the Pacific Northwest talking about the topic of charger vandalism. Lots of cut cords over there in Seattle, so we'll have plenty to show you, but we'll see what happens in the next 2 weeks. In the meantime, have a good evening and rest of your week. We'll see you in September.
Thank you.
Cheers.